Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm John Hillman, Senior Fellow in the CSIS Economics Program and Director of the Reconnecting Asia Project. With today's event, we're releasing a new CSIS series on how trade can advance strategic aims. And there's a link to the series on the event page, so please do check that out. I'd like to start by thanking the Atlas Network for supporting this effort. And I'd also like to thank the 9 experts who contributed to this series over the last 8 months. And we have 3 of those experts joining us today. Heather Conley, who is Senior Vice President at CSIS and Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program. Ambassador Kurt Tong, who is Senior Advisor with the CSIS Economics Program and partner with the Asia Group. And Matt Warner, who is President of the Atlas Network. And before I turn it over to them, let me just say a brief word about this series. I think it's become conventional wisdom and probably cliche to point out that economic power matters in foreign affairs. And yet, the United States, the world's largest economy, seems to be only using part of its economic toolkit. Tariffs, sanctions, and other coercive applications now dominate US foreign policy. Overlooked and I think underappreciated is the role that positive applications or inducements can play in advancing strategic aims. And it's pretty clear that other countries, including US competitors, appreciate this. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I've spent the last 4 years tracking, is an ocean of inducements. Not all of them will work out, but China uses carrots effectively to align policy preferences in foreign capitals, to pull partners into its orbit, and to set standards that others will have to follow. Somewhat ironically, I think a lot of US strategists would acknowledge the logic of China's moves, and yet they miss sometimes how the United States could also be doing this. And so this series is really intended to draw attention to an underappreciated area. The point isn't that trade is the solution to every challenge the US faces, nor does the series gloss over the difficulties of doing trade deals correctly. But it is intended to highlight an imbalance that exists and, in my own opinion, should be addressed as part of a smarter US foreign policy strategy. And today we're going to touch on 3 areas where trade has the potential to deliver strategic gains. We're going to start first with Heather Conley, who's going to discuss the potential for a US-UK deal, timely given negotiations this week. And so with that, Heather, why don't I turn it over to you?
John, thank you so much. This is a great idea to think about the strategic nature of trade, particularly as we think about a future US-UK free trade agreement. I think in some ways it's been very difficult to really understand the strategic importance of this bilateral trade agreement because so much of how strategic the US and the UK can be is really going to depend on what is negotiated between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And really over the last several months, we've sort of been stuck in a cycle where not much is happening. But now, as the fall and a deadline is facing us, I think we're going to get some important clues. But perhaps the most strategic part about this is really concentrating on the United Kingdom. And I think in some ways we get so swept up in, at least I know I have for the last 4 years, sort of analyzing the day-to-day drama from the Brexit referendum to the withdrawal agreement, we sort of lose what's happening. The fact that the United Kingdom is really taking a bold, I would argue, audacious reorientation of its entire economy, not only internally, and certainly the Boris Johnson administration is looking at the so-called leveling up, which is a really a different internal economic strategy for the country that has grown so important on digital and financial services based in the City of London. But of course, this whole external reorientation of their global trade pattern. So, I mean, if we can imagine, for the last 47 years, the United Kingdom has been part of the largest single market and trading bloc in the world. And it's made a decision now to be nimble, to be flexible, to see if it can make these gains. And that's the bold, audacious experiment. We don't know how and if this will be successful. So it's not really, I think many times we look at trade and we just go right into those numbers and we say, okay, what's the numerical value of this trade? And when you look at the US-UK free trade agreement, the numbers aren't there, to be honest with you. We have extremely low tariffs. So some have estimated that a US-UK free trade agreement may only sort of increase UK GDP by 0.16% over a 15-year period. So that doesn't seem like it's a compelling strategic reason to have a bilateral trade agreement. But if there can be much more significant alignment, particularly in regulatory harmonization and around the areas where the United States and the United Kingdom have an unfair competitive advantage, and that is in the whole suite of digital services and e-commerce, that's really the innovation that we potentially see. But as I said, it's hard to understand, in fact, what the shape of the US-UK free trade agreement will be until there is some clarity on the UK-EU front. But I think we have some important clues, and I feel like this is sort of breaking news as we're having this conversation, just checking the headlines coming out of London this afternoon. It looks as if the UK will have the first free trade agreement in its post-Brexit world with Japan. So the Japanese trade negotiator was in London for the last 2 days. And I think this is a very important clue to see how big of a reorientation we're really talking about. It appears, and we don't know the details, but it appears that simply what's happened is the UK has rolled over the existing EU-Japan a trade agreement with some important tweaks, potentially. I don't mean to underestimate them. But so we're not seeing this wholesale change of the UK's trading patterns with the European Union. In some ways, their first agreement is really a lighter version of the EU. So that may signal or give a clue to us that we may be not seeing such big, significant reorientation. But what's so important about the UK-Japan agreement is, as we hope to see it, it looks like perhaps at the end of this month we'll have more details. It focuses on digital, data, and financial services. And that's exactly the strength of a US-UK free trade agreement, definitely that digital dynamic. But another clue, and John, this gets back to what you were saying about this very powerful toolkit that the US is using by way of pain. And I think it goes, we need to keep reminding ourselves that the US has really been approaching both EU and the UK with a lot of painful tools, steel and aluminum tariffs, which are still on. The UK is caught up certainly in the Airbus tariffs and may be subject to additional ones. The United Kingdom has said that they will place a 2% digital services tax on digital services, and we know the U.S. Trade Representative's Office is already starting a process to see if it, the U.S. would reciprocate. So at the same time, you see the first clue, which it looks like the U.K. is doing a little bit more of a lighter version of EU trade agreements. And you have the U.S. in a much more, a role of punishment, if you will. It sort of lends one to think, well, how strategic is this U.S.-UK free trade agreement going to be? And what decisions will the U.K. make? Will they look towards the North American market? Would they potentially join USMCA? Again, a devastating decision yesterday, in my view, for the US to impose steel tariffs again on Canada, despite a multilateral trade agreement. Will the UK join the CPTPP, which may be another way for them to basically have a trade agreement with the US should the US join TPP at some future point. So lots of questions, lots of uncertainty, but this is a bold experiment. We're just not sure where that experiment is going to take us. So I'll turn it back over to you.
That's great, thank you. And I think the movement with Japan, another reminder, the world isn't waiting for us to get our affairs in order, and there's a risk of remaining on the sidelines, of allowing others to move ahead without us, and as you point out, of getting into these or exacerbating some of these tensions with some of our partners and allies when we might have some bigger issues to align on. So that I think that's all important, and actually, in a sense, related to our next topic here, which is Taiwan. In a sense, one of the big challenges for the U.S.-UK trade agreement are political calendars. I mean, this is something that's a challenge for any trade negotiator, or wanting those political calendars to align. It seems, though, that in the case of Taiwan, there might be political momentum for considering an idea that has been certainly floated in the past. And so to help us understand that, and also the strategic rationale of considering that as an option, let me turn it over to Ambassador Tong.
Thanks, John. And I'm really pleased to be participating in this particular event because I just want to start by endorsing the framing that you provided at the beginning of the United States having drifted. And it's not only a Trump administration thing, although the Trump administration has certainly doubled down on this problem, drifting towards viewing economic statecraft and economic foreign policy as primarily a question of negative leverage, punishment, sanctions, putting it to people, sticking it to other countries, rather than thinking about plus-sum outcomes. And that, of course, naturally flows from this idea about sovereignty that the president gave that long speech at the United Nations about, talking about how sovereignty is so important, not really other countries' sovereignty, but our sovereignty, that we cannot sacrifice any of our freedom of maneuver, even if we see a possible plus sum as opposed to zero sum deal on the table. So it's a very important thing to do, what you're doing with this forum, of reminding people, we have a president who wrote The Art of the Deal that has concluded very few, and that deals are out there, plus some positive use of leverage is out there. So the Taiwan example, I think, fits rather neatly into that context. The possibility of doing a comprehensive trade agreement, whether it's called a free trade agreement or a pretty good trade agreement or a not too bad trade agreement, is not so important. But a comprehensive trade agreement, cross-sectoral, deep, far-reaching, has been discussed, as you noted, many times in the past, often at the instigation of the Taiwan side, and usually through the lens of China policy. Like, by doing this, what does it mean about the one China policy of the United States? What does it say about what message we're sending to China about Taiwan, as opposed to the policy itself, the actual agreement, the content, and the benefit of it? So I wrote a piece for CSIS a few months ago, acknowledging that people are debating the idea of a Taiwan FTA or trade agreement because of the current status of U.S.-China relations, which are very tense and very negative, but that there are other good reasons to be doing it, and tried to put an emphasis on what those are. In the case of Taiwan, it's an advanced economy, high income, technology rich island of 20 million people, which is generally speaking quite open to international trade and investment, but there are some issues so that can be resolved through a comprehensive agreement that would be to the advantage of the United States, as well as Taiwan. The benefit to Taiwan would be primarily political, in associating itself with the United States and establishing its standing as a WTO member, of some standing in the international community, with some improved access to the U.S. market. And I think that the bulk of the benefits would flow to the United States in practical terms by eliminating some of the remaining barriers to trade and investment with Taiwan. But the strategic benefit goes beyond that, particularly given the technological endowments of Taiwan as one of the most important places in semiconductor manufacturing and design. There is a real strategic trade element to this, which would be quite significant for the United States. It would provide an opportunity for the U.S. to reestablish its standing in the Indo-Pacific community as a leader on shaping economic policy and the economic architecture of the region in a way that does not require the U.S. going back to TPP, which is problematic and could be quite difficult in the short term. And it allows an opportunity, given the eagerness on the Taiwan side, to set an agenda, a specific economic agenda that would be useful to the United States in establishing more precedent. It could reinforce some of the precedents that were established in the USMCA. Also double down on the digital trade ideas that are also being explored, as Heather noted, between the UK and Japan, and also the US and Japan have made progress on that. And it could even do some interesting new things, like the idea of a carbon tariff, or something that building environmental policy into a trade agreement in a positive way. So I think the point of my piece was to emphasize that there are economic policy reasons for doing this, trade policy reasons, investment reasons, actual benefit to doing a plus sum agreement with an important economy, and that we should do it for those reasons, and perhaps in addition to China policy reasons, and reap some of the China policy benefits on the side, but primarily focus on the economic aspects, which also helps fend off some of the criticisms that might come from either inside the United States or from China about the one China policy aspects. So there you go. Looking forward to the discussion.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you. And I think that there's a strong, I think part of the case for this is also, the signaling aspect, which you underscored. This would give the U.S. A presence, in a sense, in Asia where it hasn't been as active on trade policy. I mean, historically active, but not recently. And I think that's been one of the challenges in the broader U.S.-China competition. China, as it's been rolling out Belt and Road, signing 130 or however many countries up to it. The U.S. has been criticizing it, but it hasn't had its own positive vision to speak to. And so I think the more examples of positive, affirmative alternatives that could be offered, the stronger position the U.S. might have. So I think there's also an interesting, maybe historical comparison to, first U.S. FTA was with Israel, which at the time was, of sort of modest economic importance, but the U.S. was able to do things with that agreement that provided a template for future agreements. So as you're suggesting, there might be an opportunity to do something interesting there for broader regional gain. I think that's a fascinating angle to explore further. Another topic that we want to touch on today. I mean, it's something we're all living with. It's why we're doing this conversation virtually right now. Is the pandemic, and this is a challenge that has, I think, really underscored some of the risks of connectivity and globalization, and it's frankly, it's tested a lot of economies. You have over 100 economies now going to the IMF for debt relief, and their aid has been important in the sort of early response efforts, but trade could also play a very important role in helping some of these economies recover and to do so in a sustainable way. And on that, I'd like to pass it over to Matt Warner, and also want to thank him again for helping us do this initiative. I know it was kind of a strange idea when I came to him with it, because it's just not something that people, unfortunately, are talking about as much these days. But again, want to thank him for that support.
Well, thank you, John. I've very much appreciated and enjoyed the opportunity to partner with you, and it's exactly for conversations like this. Next to Heather and the ambassador and yourself, I'm not a trade expert, but my organization, Atlas Network, invests in think tanks that are working on trade. It is a priority for us. And part of that is this project that we have called Dignity Unbound, focused on ending poverty for good. And as you say, the opportunities to think of trade policy in these terms, and not just foreign aid as a tool to end poverty, is a major part of what I think the discussion should be about. And so I really grateful for both Heather and the ambassador for their comments, and I'm also concerned about the overall drift in the way we think about trade, both um, in Washington and in the broader public conversation about it. Um, and so the other piece to this that I wanted to bring in was that we are also focusing in partnership with the Women Business and Law Index from the World Bank, how gender discrimination in the law in terms of market access is a major issue. And so I was encouraged to see the new report from the WTO looking at the disparate impacts of bad trade policy on women. And I think all of this taken together in this time of COVID should be upping the stakes and the urgency around figuring out what the future of trade looks like. Ultimately, what we have found in our grant making towards local NGOs is that a lot of trade policy is put in place for various reasons, good and bad, but that there's a disproportionate burden often on low income communities on very sort of specific downstream effects. For example, in Sri Lanka, we supported a project to repeal a tariff on sanitary napkins because, based on the research of a local think tank, the use of sanitary napkins was very, very low in rural areas because of the cost prohibitiveness. And this was leading to real problems with workforce participation and school attendance for women and girls. And in Argentina, we supported a think tank project to repeal a tariff on computers and laptops because the price had jacked up so high that it was very common for people to travel to Chile in order to buy a laptop at a reasonable price or go without. So these are very narrow downstream effects of the current state of trade, but I think they help to bring it back to this very sort of topic of this event, which is the strategic logic of trade. And so I want to make a couple comments on that. But I think because of the current issues going on in the world, it's timely to be thinking big about reorienting our approach to trade in a couple of ways. First of all, the COVID economic recovery is going to require, an all the above approach to reform. We need to do everything we can to make any economic activity easier, more flexibility. The World Bank is estimating that 70 million people may slip back into extreme poverty as a result of COVID's impact. And we know that increased trade is far more effective to lift low-income communities over time than any of our best foreign aid efforts or our short-term stimulus efforts. So that's an important piece to be thinking about right now. At the same time, with the WTO in a leadership transition and little recent progress on multilateralism and liberalization, some are saying that multilateralism is likely over, at least for the time being, and so bilateral and plurilateral agreements are kind of where we can put our best hope and hope for some sort of snowball iterative process for increasing participation. And so in that context, I think both Heather and the ambassador put forward some very smart, timely recommendations that kind of fall into this category of in this time of COVID, we should be inventorying what are the things that we can act quickly on and that make a lot of sense, and do everything we can to prevent a very protracted process. There's also a larger piece that's that may seem unrelated, but I think it is. The other era that some say is over is what political scientists Stephen Holmes and Ivan Krastev call the age of imitation. So the 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, where the hope of liberal hegemony and the multilateral efforts to install Western institutions all across the world, often in great cooperation with developing countries, we are starting to feel a little bit of the disappointment of that failure, that failed experiment. And that is having some far-reaching consequences and raising questions about what does it look like to actually build sustained institutions that are more sensitive to local context and don't make the mistake of trying to transplant, a free trade, property rights, free market system in other places. Let me be clear. I do believe that those are the right institutions to be building to solve global poverty. But there's a big mind shift that has to happen, and what I worry is that breakdown of there's a lack of nuance in looking back at that experiment and thinking that this means that we should reject liberal democracy. And that's what we're seeing in the rise of authoritarian populism in different places where what Coercive and Holmes argue is it's not necessarily a rejection of liberalism on its merits, it's just a rejection of the way it's been evangelized and imposed. And this dovetails, I think, with what we're seeing from Putin and Viktor Orban and the Trump administration, a mindset shift as it applies to trade that thinks in terms not as a win-win, but as countries as firms that are competing with each other. And what Coercive and Holmes predict is that the future of international relations and in particular trade is going to be just an endless one-upmanship and negotiation around a laundry list of issues, some of which we've talked about, technology in particular. And so that is not, to me, the strategic logic of trade. The strategic logic of trade, again, is getting back to this idea of win-win, which is just, I think, empirically the nature of trade as we see it increase and can measure its effects. So I'm proposing a three-pronged approach, and I share this with a great deal of modesty, again, as someone who has been interested in supporting these kinds of conversations, but not necessarily on par as an expert with my colleagues here. But I think for my part, I will continue to support projects both here and abroad that identify narrow achievable opportunities in the short term to provide unilateral relief, because even small changes can have big effects. That tariff that was repealed in Argentina, we visited a school in the low-income neighborhood of Dock Sud, where a local school had received a donation of laptops for the first time, that they had access to that kind of technology. And it's because the prices came much closer to market prices after the removal of the tariff. So we can imagine the ripple effects of even some of these very narrow slices of trade policy. But then I think, secondly, we should be fast tracking any doorstep opportunities, such as those that Heather and the ambassador discussed, any opportunities for bilateral or plurilateral agreements that we can try to add to and snowball over time. But then again, I think the most ambitious thing I think we ought to be doing, both in the context of the changing idea of the future not being a battle over ideology, but just a competition of nations as firms, and the lack of optimism for the future of the WTO's ability to lead comprehensive, as the ambassador says, multilateral agreements. What can we be doing to be also complementing the efforts I mentioned with a real shift in mindset back to that strategic logic of trade, which is win-win, and to have a presumption of unilateralism as a long-term strategy. I think this is a way that the U.S. can demonstrate leadership by testing the hypothesis that over time, we can be a leader and take that leap of faith on some of the thorniest issues like agriculture, and with the idea that that others will follow. And I think that's going to be critical, not just for the purpose I think a lot about, which is accelerating the decline in global poverty, particularly in this time of COVID, but also as an important piece for our own economic recovery here in the U.S. So I'll end my comments there. And again, thanks for this opportunity.
Great, thanks, Matt. And for those of you watching, and if you'd like to submit a question, there was a link in the invitation, the original invitation. So if you have that, you can submit a question that way. We've also just added a link to the event page. So if you want to refresh, I promise you we're not going anywhere. If you refresh the page, there will be a link to submit questions. And I will try to get through a few of those with the time that we have remaining. Heather, if I could, I might start with you. I did get a question actually just before the event from someone who had read the series, and they were, they were saying, well, you really should have had a piece on U.S. EU, and I agree. If we could have had twice the number of pieces in this series, but their point was, if we look at the landscape right now, that is an agreement that could carry far-reaching strategic significance. It's obviously something we've tried in the past. A lot of time has been spent. And as you noted, tariffs are relatively low. So future gains have to come through, aligning regulations, harmonizing standards. And so it's tough. It's really technical. We've run into a lot of issues in the past, but the geopolitical environment has also changed quite significantly since we're really moving that effort forward. Does that help the case for a US-EU agreement? Still a lot of political calendars to consider, but does it become more feasible, more urgent in today's geopolitical context?
Thanks, John. I mean, it's a great question. And I think all of those of us that are dedicated transatlanticists have just seen, over a decade plus of missed opportunities of strengthening the U.S.-EU trade relationship. So I'm going to sort of flip the question around. I think it's still okay that the essay collection focused on the U.S.-UK free trade agreement, and here's sort of my theory of that. So I know and I understand completely inherently a US-UK FTA looks like it is absolutely the strongest anti-EU message that we could send, particularly because President Trump has been so enthusiastic about Brexit. He's been so enthusiastic about this US-UK FTA. But here's sort of, this could be potentially exactly the bridge that we need to build to a US-EU. The UK has always been, when it was within the European Union, a bridge between the US and the EU. We've now lost that bridge, but perhaps they can do this in trade, which is why I'm so curious to see what ultimately this US-UK FTA, because the UK is going to have to make some decisions about whether it's going to stick with the regulatory harmonization of the European Union market, or are they going to perhaps make some decisions that lean maybe in some areas more towards the North American market. And that would be a bridge where we could get some movement on regulatory harmonization. And that's where the value is. But as you rightly state, and I know Kurt has had millions more experience with this, the problem is, and this was very true with the US-EU TTIP process, which has just sort of ended, it's going to be a problem with the US-UK. We get stuck on agriculture. As important as I know agriculture is domestically and politically, but the problem is these agreements just get so bogged down in that. What happens is then we can't realize the opportunity, which is the future. And exactly what Kurt said, we need templates for the future economy. That's data, that's digital, that's that whole sweep of fintech, regtech, biotech, all of that. That's where we want this future trading relationship to go to build the standards for a Western democratic approach. The problem is these big agreements really get bogged down in the most difficult political issues over geographic indicators and genetically modified organisms. And I know those are important. I know the questions that we're already getting, yes, those are very important, but it also prevents us to get to the future. And so I see the potential for the US-UK free trade agreement to be a bridge that perhaps gets us to a better US-EU relationship. But if we continue from the US perspective to see all of our allies as trade adversaries, we are not only going to diminish the alliance and the relationship, we're diminishing US trade and investment opportunities. And I think that's just absolutely unacceptable. We need, in this age, in this moment, to only be finding those opportunities of enhancement, and that enhancement path lies with Europe.
Ambassador Tong, if I could turn to you for a second. This is outside the scope of the piece that you wrote, and you're welcome to pass on this if you want, but very much in line with your experience in the region. What, if any, positive economic tools should the U.S. be using to advance its interests in regards to Hong Kong? Clearly, we've been putting in place some restrictions. It's a challenging situation, but do you see, what if any options do you see in the U.S. economic toolkit?
The U.S. national interest in Hong Kong has been multifaceted. The U.S. has always seen Hong Kong as a lighthouse, if you will, of a Chinese society that is organized in a way that allows for openness, free expression, a degree of democracy, and considerable openness to the international community, sort of a cosmopolitan Chinese society, like Singapore, like Taiwan, unlike the PRC. The other, primary U.S. interest in Hong Kong over the years has been increasingly in finance. It started out being in trade, and I was consul general in Hong Kong, and my predecessors there, 175 years earlier, were there primarily to make ships go back and forth across the Pacific with stuff in them. That's not what Hong Kong is about now, and that's not what the U.S. interest is there. It's primarily the financial market and the ability of Hong Kong to bridge between the world's largest economy, which has a closed capital account, and the world's second largest economy, us, which has an open capital account and the dominant currency. And so a long way of saying the U.S. interest in Hong Kong on economic matters is the status quo. It's fine the way it is. So what the positive sum agenda is actually is not destroying U.S. interests in when there's a trade-off between the political agenda that the U.S. has in Hong Kong and the economic agenda. There's this instinct, and we're seeing it now, to shoot yourself in the foot on the economic side in order to express your unhappiness with the fact that you really actually can't stop the degradation of the situation on the political side. So the agenda should be quite simple. Just don't screw it up. Don't blow it. Allow U.S. banks, companies to continue to use Hong Kong as the excellent platform for accessing the world's largest economy that it is. Simple. Just got to do it.
Don't screw it up. Good advice. Good advice. Related question from one of the viewers here, sort of broader on China. And the question is, some seem to assume that China will not be more aggressive on trade leading up to the election. Is that a safe assumption, or could they try to take advantage of the current administration?
Well, I'm not sure what I assume that's directed at me, and I'm not sure what China being aggressive on trade means. It's already quite aggressive by having an unfair external trade regime and set of rules and lots of limitations and unfair practices domestically on foreign investors and traders inside China. So further aggression by or activity by China, I guess they have the option of ripping up the bilateral agreement. People who observe this wonder who's going to do it first. Because it's a semi-successful agreement of mutual benefit, but both sides are really unhappy with each other. So then, who rips it up first? I don't know. Maybe they'll do it at the same time. They'll like to be announcements the same day that U.S. and China both saying, "Wait, this is a terrible agreement. Wait, no, it's a good agreement, but we don't like each other, so we're going to get rid of it." And then everyone will forget about that the next day. So, but lots of companies will be affected by the end result of that. So people are following it.
Matt, question for you here. You work with a lot of groups outside the United States who work on trade issues. Where do you see, the strongest sort of the demand signals for U.S. engagement?
Well, everybody has a strong response when you ask, what should the U.S. be doing? People want to see leadership. The local think tanks that I work with, in particular, I think are also interested in that third piece I mentioned, which is just sort of our rhetorical understanding of what we're up to when we're pursuing improved trade agreements and increasing trade. An example, I know that in Argentina, we have an economist, a colleague who has talked about the impact of readmitting Argentina into the system of preferences as having regional impact on optimism for increased trade over the long term. So there are symbolic symbols to making progress. Again, doing that iterative process of increasing participation blocks in the region. In Indonesia, our partner there has also found it useful to look at better practices on non-tariff measures from other places, including the U.S., to argue for, and this hits on the agricultural question, restrictions on rice imports that drive household proportion of income high on, feeding your family. So again, I think, whatever we do, people are watching. I mean, people are, I have the experience. I mean, I guess I'm used to being outmatched in terms of knowledge most places I go, but I have the experience of when I visit countries, they know so much more about us than we know about them. And they're looking to what we're doing. And so on free trade, which again, if we can rhetorically reassert what, trade is the thing that economists of all stripes agree on the most. If you look at surveys of economists, there isn't as much of any sort of ideological divide among economists on the benefits of trade. So that gets lost in the political rhetoric of protectionism and when people who have access to the process, tend to be those who with special interests, and the voices of those who might have a disproportionate impact aren't heard. So again, I think U.S. leadership should try to not give in to this drift of America being just another selfish state among selfish states, but to understand that we actually gain by leading on a presumption of inclusiveness and unilateralism as much as possible within the realities of the way things actually work.
Thanks very much. So with that, I think we're actually at the end here. Let me thank again our experts for joining us. And also let me thank the experts who are not able to join us but contributed to the series. Please take a look at that. Again, there's a link to it on the event page. Let us know what you think. This is, again, an issue that we're trying to do more work on, trying to draw some attention to, and think creatively about. We acknowledge that all of these issues are complex. Getting any deal done is incredibly difficult. The devil is in the details. And we would love to continue some of those conversations with those of you who watch this. With that, let me thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon. Thanks.